Hello, and welcome to The History Behind, the podcast that explores the stories and events that have shaped our world. In this episode, we'll be delving into the fascinating history of inflation. While everyone has heard the word inflation, very few people understand what it means. Simply put, inflation is the rate at which general levels of prices for goods and services is increasing. It means that over time, your money will buy less and less than it did before. But why is inflation important? Inflation can have a significant impact on the economy, including increasing the cost of living, reducing the value of savings and investments, and making it more difficult for businesses and individuals to plan for the future. In this episode, we'll be exploring the history of inflation, from its origins to the modern-day economy. We'll be discussing key factors that contribute to inflation, such as changes in supply and demand, the role of central banks, and historical events that have influenced inflation rates. So sit back, relax, and join us as we take a journey through time to uncover the fascinating history of inflation. It means that over time, your money will buy less and less than it did before. While it may seem like a bad thing, inflation isn't always negative. In fact, mild inflation can have a positive impact on the economy by encouraging spending and investments, promoting economic growth, and reducing the real value of debt. However, high inflation rates can be problematic as they can lead to a decrease in purchasing power, devalue savings, and cause economic instability. But how did inflation as we know it start? Well, we don't need to travel that far back in time to find the beginnings of what we know as inflation. We start during the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was a period of rapid industrialization that began in Britain in the late 18th century and spread to other parts of the world, including Europe and the United States in the 19th century. The period is typically divided into three phases. The first phase, from 1760 to 1840, saw the mechanization of textile production and the development of new machinery and techniques. The second phase, from 1840 to 1870, saw the spread of industrialization to other sectors of the economy, including mining, transportation, and manufacturing. And the third phase, from 1870 to 1914, saw the widespread adoption of electrical power and the development of new forms of communication and transportation. The Industrial Revolution was made possible by several factors, including the availability of capital for investment, a stable political environment, and an abundant supply of natural resources such as coal and iron. It was also facilitated by a number of technological innovations, such as the spinning jenny, the steam engine, and the power loom. The Industrial Revolution had a profound impact on society, transforming the way that people lived and worked. It led to the development of new forms of transportation, such as the steam engine and the locomotive, which made it possible to move goods and people faster and more efficiently than ever before. It also led to the development of new manufacturing techniques and machinery, which increased the productivity of workers and made it possible to produce goods on a large scale. However, one of the unforeseen consequences of the Industrial Revolution was inflation. During the Industrial Revolution, there was a rapid increase in the production of goods, fueled by new manufacturing techniques and machinery. This led to an increase in demand for raw materials such as cotton and coal, which were needed to power the factories. As demand for these materials increased, so did their prices, which in turn led to an increase in the prices of goods that were produced using these materials. The Industrial Revolution led to significant changes in the labor market. As people migrated from rural areas to cities to work in the factories, there was an increase in the number of workers competing for jobs. This led to an overall decrease in wages, as employers could pay their workers less due to the surplus of labor. The combination of increased demand for raw materials and decreased wages led to an increase in the cost of production, which ultimately was passed on to the consumers in the form of higher prices for goods. This is what's known as cost-push inflation, which occurs when the cost of production increases and it's passed on to the consumers. In addition to cost-push inflation, the growth of industry also led to demand-pull inflation. As people earned more money and had more disposable income, their demand for goods and services increased. This increase in demand led to an increase in prices, as producers could charge more for their products due to the high demand. But how do governments and economies handle inflation? Most do it using central banks. Central banks are financial institutions that are responsible for managing a country's monetary policy and regulating its financial system. They're typically government-owned or operated and are responsible for implementing policies that promote financial stability and economic growth. Central banks have a variety of functions, including controlling the money supply, setting interest rates, and regulating banks and other financial institutions. They also often serve as a lender of last resort, providing emergency funding to banks and other financial institutions during times of crisis. Central banks play a critical role in managing inflation, which is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services is rising. By controlling the money supply and setting interest rates, central banks can influence the level of economic activity and inflation in the economy. Examples of central banks include the Federal Reserve System in the United States, the European Central Bank in Europe, and the Bank of Japan in Japan. Each central bank has its own set of policies and objectives, but all share the common goal of promoting economic stability and growth in their respective countries. Central banks play a crucial role in controlling inflation. They are responsible for setting a monetary policy and regulating the supply of money in the economy. Central banks use a variety of tools, such as adjusting interest rates and controlling the money supply, to influence inflation and maintain price stability. The Federal Reserve is one of the most well-known central banks in the world and was created in response to inflation in the United States. In the early 20th century, the United States economy was experiencing high levels of inflation, which were caused in part by the gold standard and the lack of a central bank. The gold standard required that the U.S. dollar be backed by gold, which limited the amount of money the government could print, but it also made it difficult to respond to changing economic conditions. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed, which created the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve is responsible for regulating the money supply, setting interest rates, and supervising banks to ensure the stability of the financial system. By controlling the supply of money and credit, the Federal Reserve can influence inflation and maintain price stability. One of the primary tools the Federal Reserve uses to control inflation is the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is the interest rate at which banks lend money to each other overnight, and it serves as a benchmark for other interest rates in the economy. By adjusting the federal funds rate, the Federal Reserve can influence the cost of borrowing for businesses and consumers, which can in turn affect the level of economic activity and inflation. While it may seem, due to timing, that the inflation caused by the Industrial Revolution was responsible for the creation of the Federal Reserve in the United States, inflationary pressure was only a small part of the birth of the Federal Reserve. Before the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the U.S. banking system was highly decentralized, with many small, independent banks operating under a patchwork of state-level regulations. This made it difficult for governments to respond to financial panics and economic crises, which could easily spread across state lines and cause widespread bank failures and economic disruptions. In addition, the U.S. economy was experiencing a period of rapid growth and expansion in the early 20th century, which created new challenges for monetary policy and financial regulation. The gold standard, which tied the value of the U.S. dollar to the value of gold, made it difficult for the government to respond to changing economic conditions, and there was a growing sense that a central bank was needed to provide stability and regulation to the financial system. The creation of the Federal Reserve was seen as a necessary step toward modernizing and stabilizing the U.S. financial system, rather than a direct response of inflation created by the Industrial Revolution. However, once the Federal Reserve was established, it did play an important role in managing inflation and promoting economic stability, including during periods of rapid industrial growth and expansion. Inflation in the 20th century was also marked by a number of significant events, including the impacts of both World War I and World War II on global economic stability. During World War I, many countries experienced a significant increase in inflation as they struggled to finance the costs of the war. This massive increase in government spending led to a corresponding increase in the money supply, which in turn drove up prices and contributed to inflation. After the war, many countries attempted to curb inflation by returning to the gold standard, which had been abandoned during the war. However, the gold standard proved to be inflexible and difficult to manage, and many countries struggled to maintain stable exchange rates and control inflation. Germany was one country badly affected by hyperinflation after World War I. During the 1920s, inflation caused the price of bread to rise to over 200 billion marks at one point. The average citizen would have to use a wheelbarrow full of money just to buy everyday items. This was just one of the factors that led to dissatisfaction with the government and led to the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. The global economic upheaval caused by World War II only further exacerbated inflationary pressures, as countries once again ramped up their production and spending to support the war effort. The post-war era saw a period of rapid economic growth and expansion, but this growth was also accompanied by rising inflation and instability in many countries. In order to manage inflation and promote global economic stability, the Bretton Woods system was established in 1944. Under this system, the United States dollar was pegged to gold at a fixed rate, and all other countries' currencies were pegged to the US dollar. This system helped promote stable exchange rates and control inflation, but it was not without its challenges. The 1970s saw an end to the Bretton Woods system in the United States. One of the key factors was the growing trade imbalance between the United States and other countries. Under the Bretton Woods system, the United States dollar was the world's reserve currency, and other countries held a large amount of US dollars as a result of international trade. However, as the U.S. trade deficit grew, other countries began to lose confidence in the U.S. dollar, and they started to exchange their dollars for gold, which put pressure on the U.S. gold reserves. In addition, domestic economic pressures in the United States, such as high costs of the Vietnam War and the growing budget deficit, made it difficult for the U.S. government to maintain its gold peg. As a result, in 1971, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would no longer exchange U.S. dollars for gold, effectively ending the gold standard and the Bretton Woods system. After the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, many countries moved to a floating exchange rate, which allowed their currencies to fluctuate freely based on market forces. This system provided more flexibility, but it also made it more difficult to control inflation and maintain stable exchange rates. This only added to the rest of the pressures on the global economy and increased inflation. Hyperinflation during the 1980s was the cause of another collapse of a government. Inflation was a factor in the collapse of the economy in the Soviet Union, ultimately leading to the end of the Cold War. In the 21st century, inflation has continued to be a significant economic issue, with several notable examples of inflationary pressure, including the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. During the 2008 financial crisis, many countries experienced high levels of inflation as a result of the collapse of the housing market and the subsequent credit crunch. Governments around the world responded with monetary and fiscal policies designed to stimulate economic growth and reduce inflationary pressure, including quantitative easing and lower interest rates. More recently, the COVID-19 pandemic has also led to inflationary pressures in many countries, as governments have implemented large-scale stimulus measures to support their economies during the pandemic. These measures have included direct payments to individuals and businesses, as well as low interest rates and other forms of financial support. To manage inflation in the 21st century, modern central banks have adopted a variety of tools and strategies, including monetary policy, fiscal policy, and financial regulation. Central banks are responsible for setting interest rates and controlling the money supply. They also work closely with governments to develop and implement fiscal policies designed to promote economic stability and growth. In recent years, many central banks have adopted a more flexible approach to inflation management, focusing on targeting inflation within a specific range rather than aiming for a specific inflation rate. This approach allows central banks to respond to changing economic conditions and adjust their policies accordingly. Overall, inflation remains an important economic issue in the 21st century, and central banks continue to play a critical role in managing inflation and promoting economic stability. As the global economy continues to evolve, central banks will need to adapt and develop new strategies to meet the challenges of the future. The history of inflation teaches us the importance of balancing economic growth with stable prices. While mild inflation can be beneficial, high inflation rates can cause significant economic instability. By understanding the history of inflation and the tools used to manage it, we can work toward a stable and prosperous global economy in the future. Thanks for tuning in to The History Behind. We hope you enjoyed learning about the fascinating stories and events that have shaped our world. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you'll never miss a new episode. If you have any suggestions of topics you'd like us to cover in future videos, please leave them in the comments below. And if you want to keep the conversation going, you can follow us on social media. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.